We've had a pretty continuous, long relationship with VMA. I'd like to thank Leighton and Michael Briley, who's obviously not here today, for allowing us to be part of the sponsorship program. It's really good to see people in the room. And I guess from my point of view, a couple of quick announcements from our side. I've opened an office in Perth over the last couple of months, so we've got an outlet there. I've also got a solid outlet in Brisbane and Melbourne now. So thank you very much, everyone, and let's get on with this session.
So thank you very much, Paul, and PBM Safety for your continuing support of the Congress. The next session is security. Where to from here? The past 18 months have been a focus on COVID and all the safety overlay that has entailed. Remember not so long ago when we were consumed with security. This session will focus on real and present threats, learnings from Manchester, and practical venue security considerations. I'd like to welcome back to the stage the facilitator, Leighton Wood. Leighton is the current interim CEO of Grande Experiences, having recently completed 11 years with the award-winning Melbourne Convention and Exhibition Centre as Deputy Chief Executive and Chief Operating Officer. He is currently the President of the Venue Management Association of Australia and Pacific and sits as a member of the General Assembly for Greenpeace Australia and Pacific. Leighton was previously CEO of Melbourne 2006 Commonwealth Games, Melbourne Major Events Company, Sports Knowledge Australia, and the Princess Alexandra Hospital Foundation. Thank you, Leighton.
Thank you, Catherine. And let me introduce my fellow panellists today. And starting from the far side, Jamie Templeton, Acting Superintendent, VicPol. Thanks, Jamie, for coming along. Darren Horn in the middle, Senior Manager Security and Safety here at MCEC. And Michael Roberts on this side, Director of Security and Safety and Precinct Operations at the MCG. A very learned crew, and hopefully we can pick their brains sufficiently to make the next hour extremely valuable for all assembled. Catherine said, you know, we have been obsessed with COVID over the last 20 months or so, but it wasn't very long before that, and we're obsessed with terrorist activity. And the intelligence suggests that hasn't gone away. In fact, the intelligence suggests it's going to be harder and harder to detect and prevent as it sort of moves to lone extremists and less communication, less pre-organisation. And that rings alarm bells for people in our industry. I think it's really timely to reflect on the recently concluded Manchester Arena bombing inquiry. There's a 200-page report. And I initially thought I'd read it as fast as I could through this hour and just see where I finished up, but instead I've decided to provide the highlights to the gathering here today. From an industry association perspective, I think this is our sweet spot. We need to be providing information and intelligence to our members that help them in the conduct of their roles. And this is a case in point. There's not too many in this room that will take the time or have the time to read the 200 pages. So listen up, because this is really important stuff. I'll go through the case study initially. I'm going to hand over to Jamie, who's going to talk about how VicPol approaches the prevention and mitigation of such incidents. And then we're going to go to two practitioners, importantly, sitting out the front here, and Darren and Michael, to talk about the lessons that they see that are immediately applicable in their space.
A damning inquiry into the Manchester Arena bombing has found that suicide bomber Salman Abedi should have been identified as a security threat. Families of the 22 people killed say their loved ones were failed on every level.
It was May 2017 at an Ariana Grande concert when Salman Abedi walked into Manchester Arena and blew himself up.
Oh my God. What's going on? What just happened? What's going on?
22 people were killed and hundreds injured. Now a public inquiry has found a litany of security failures and missed opportunities to prevent or minimise the devastation.
I have concluded that there were serious shortcomings in the security provided.
Among the failings, 2 police officers who could have been patrolling the arena instead took a 2-hour break to get kebabs, a CCTV blind spot that allowed Abidi to carry out reconnaissance at the venue without raising suspicion, and 2 stewards who fobbed off a man trying to warn them that Salman Abidi was acting strangely.
Today, our heartbreak turns to anger. We entrusted the safety of our loved ones into organisations and agencies who had a duty of care to protect them.
So I'll just start with a little bit of scene setting. On the 22nd of May 2017, an extremist detonated the bomb in his backpack as the audience was exiting an Ariana Grande concert, killing 23, hospitalising 112 and injuring 1,000 people. The national risk rating at the time was severe, that is, a terrorist attack was likely. The bomber had visited the site 3 times in the day leading up to the concert. He wore clothing inappropriately heavy for the weather conditions. He wore a cap. He carried a 30-kilogram backpack into the foyer area that visibly impacted his gait. He sat in a CCTV blind spot in that same foyer for an hour prior to detonation. He was approached by a member of the public asking why he appeared to be hiding with what was a large backpack. A different member of the public alerted a security guard of his suspicions. 15 minutes later and 10 minutes prior to detonation, that security guard passed the information on to his supervisor. The supervisor talked to the bomber but didn't want to hassle him so as not to appear racist. In my opinion, someone who worked in a building like this for 10 years, bad things happen when a succession of things go wrong. It's not ever one thing in my experience. In fact, there's a TV series on at the moment, 11 Reasons Why the Titanic Sunk. And it goes back to the Swiss cheese theory. If you've got enough mitigations in place, it's very difficult to have the holes align and for problems to occur. I want to go through the findings quickly of the inquiry and then talk about the conclusions and talk about the implications of those conclusions for our industry. So the security had been provided online training only. The training was on their own time. They were not paid to do the training. Training included 2 45-minute videos. One of those videos dedicated specifically to identifying suspicious persons. The guards on duty in the foyer that evening admitted to not having watched either of those videos. When they did an investigation, it was found the videos were each watched for an average of 4 minutes by the people doing their training. There was no refresher training and there was no assessment. CCTV coverage, as was indicated in the earlier footage, was insufficient. There were blind spots in that coverage. Venue management were unaware of the blind spot. Had they been aware, it could have been mitigated by security patrols. At the time of the event, people who had the responsibility of monitoring CCTV in the UK had to achieve certain certification to do so. Bizarrely, anyone that worked for the venue didn't need to do that certification. The 2 people monitoring that night were 2 people that were employed by the venue and therefore did not have the certification. On the evening in question, a briefing with the senior sergeant on duty mandated that foyer where the bombing occurred be manned by 2 British Transport Police officers. It didn't happen. In fact, the person who was supervising the shift left the site with another officer to get kebabs for 2 hours. and throughout the time of the bombing. British Transport Police had also failed to attend recent scenario exercises. So they'd found other priorities, and no doubt they would have had other priorities, and no doubt they would have been understaffed. But that is the fact of the matter, and that's one of those things that didn't go to plan. There was a lack of clarity around responsibilities. There was the venue operator had an ongoing dispute with the Transport Police as to who was in charge of that particular space, that particular foyer, because it was between the arena and the railway station. Venue management thought it was made clear in the contract that the pre-egress checks included checking the entire foyer for suspicious persons and objects. This was in the security contract. So they thought they'd had it covered anyway. Security thought that clearing the egress area meant they just needed to make sure there were no obstacles for when people exited the venue. So there was a misunderstanding. And really importantly for this audience, the inquiry also found that it was venue management's responsibility to monitor the performance of its security contractor, something that would have exposed the misunderstanding. That's where the buck stopped. Risk assessments were conducted in a high-level manner and not specific to any particular event. The venue was a Tier 2 target as it was significant in size and part of a public transport hub. Additionally, it was run by American interests, and Ariana Grande was an American artist. There was no communication or collaboration between security, British Transport Police, or the venue when creating risk assessments. And finally, and another, I'll put a bizarrely in there again, finally the venue's risk assessment averaged out the various types of possible terrorist attack, which arrived at a low rating. Had it focused on the most likely, a bomb in a backpack, it would have been high. These were the key deficiencies. There are others. And I should say, in coming to his conclusions, I found the chair to be really fair and reasonable. It wasn't a case of 20/20 hindsight, which is really easy when you're sitting in that chair and you're not there on the night. He was really fair and reasonable, and he wasn't excessively critical, I didn't think. The conclusions of the inquiry were thus: the ability to acknowledge risk and learn from exercises had not been sufficient. The ability to implement decisions that had been made and to use the plans that had been developed had been ineffectual. The ability to coordinate and interact had been deficient. The potential inherent information and communications technology has not been exploited well enough. Leadership's willingness and ability to clarify responsibility, set goals and adopt measures to achieve results have been insufficient. Two really important points come out of this case study for mine. They were the highlights, and this is one of them. In the opinion of the Commission, these lessons learned are to a greater extent applicable to leadership, interaction, culture and attitudes than a lack of resources, the need for new legislation, organisation frameworks or important value choices. That's the people in this room. That's what it comes down to. Not about technology, not about value choices, not about any of those things. The key missing factor was leadership. And the second point, the second highlight for mine, was that you'll recall the massacre of children in 2011 on an island in Norway by a right-wing terrorist, lone assailant. Killed 19 children. The very respected UK's Institute of Strategic Risk Management has observed that the conclusions from the inquiry that followed Utoya could have been cut and pasted to the conclusions of the Manchester Arena inquiry. As venue professionals, we must learn from this stuff. We don't want another cut and paste, and particularly on our watch, and particularly in Australia that's renowned for its venue management expertise. We cannot allow that to happen. In closing, one of the key planks of Manchester Arena management's defence was that their security arrangements were not dramatically out of step with comparable venues. How do you reckon that went down with the families of those that died on that day? So that's the inquiry. A desperately sad thing to have to happen to a desperately sad event. So what today about is about learning, and the first person we're going to learn from is Jamie, and that's about VicPol's approach to mitigating these circumstances. And as I said, following Jamie's chat, we'll get Darren and Michael to talk about the implications for our industry here in Australia. Thanks, Jamie.
The very sombre mood that's been set, and I understand the tone. Please excuse me if I do try with a couple of funnies, and I do say try. Normally, so Jamie Templeton has introduced, my role with VicPol is events, crowded places, and risk around that and what that means for Victoria Police. Certainly based in the CBD, and at the moment I'm in a role where I'm actually the superintendent in charge of the city in Yarra. We're very lucky to have that. It's a real buzz as we come back out of COVID lockdown. Part of my role, other than events and event management from a VicPol perspective, is protests. So now I'm the protest officer. So the last 20 months, for those of you, unless you've been under a rock, would understand that we've been totally overwhelmed, would be a fair word, and there's a lot of other adjectives I could use, mindful of the audience, it has just been phenomenal, something that we haven't seen in Victoria Police. People my colleagues have referenced it back to Vietnam, another major type of demonstration that are very much motivated by a whole raft of different things. And I will talk about the prevention and mitigations that we use at the major events. But I think it's also, and I believe the two will come together, and I'd really be happy to take some questions about this, and I'll do my best to answer without breaching any confidentiality or privacy. But we've seen some really amazing things in terms of protest motivation, left and right, being on the same street at the same time, acting in concert with one another to protest against COVID. Now, I don't know if there's any psychs in the room or psychologists, but you'll understand that's very rare. And in my information, and there's some of the people I've spoken to that are specialists in this area, that hasn't happened before. Or if it has happened, it hasn't happened to this degree. So what does that mean? We're still working it out. Was there opportunity for recruitment of right-wing leaning ideology, maybe supremacists in there trying to grab some people who might be more along the lines of socially, educationally limited, to then try and build from that point. So there's a lot of things that come out of that. What you did see, in particular on July 24th, August 21st, September the 18th, October the 16th, I think I got all of them right, I was there front and centre at all those violent protests at some personal loss. Those violent protests, we saw up to 500 to 800 middle-aged men, some women, who were there to fight with the police. Something we haven't seen before. They weren't necessarily motivated by COVID, they took an opportunity. So what's that mean for us as venue and event managers, and for me as a police officer? Still to play out, but it's interesting times. So Link Cafe was an enormous learning for law enforcement agencies across Australia in particular, if not across the world. Victoria Police acted as quickly as we could in terms of making sure that we were better equipped. When I say better equipped, probably take the learnings and make sure that we apply them against what it is that we currently do, our training, and in particular towards senior command, of which I am one. So we looked at, are we trained to make decisions about making a decision, should I say, that maybe takes someone's life, saves someone's life in a really critical situation. So we've done a whole lot of work, and people above me and smarter than I have pulled together a team of senior police command cadre, it's called, and we're exposed to various ranges of training, case studies, both internationally and across Australia. We train collegiately with other states, or should I say we were doing that pre-COVID, and we're building it again now. There was one thing that resonated with us, a lot of us, in particular Assistant Commissioner Mick Hermans, which stuck with me. Mick heard the comment by one of the survivors of Link Cafe and said, Victoria Police and New South Wales Police and all our law enforcement agencies, you owe us to be able to make decisions in these situations. So, cracks a bit of a chord with me, so obviously a bit of a passion to make sure that we're well trained. So just in terms of one of those things that we took from that is, and we're working with our event agencies, is around the vulnerability for terrorism and vulnerability for other types of attacks on venues. We've previously applied a vulnerability assessment, but we're doing a lot more training in that space and making sure that our people are provided with the best possible training, if you like, to undertake those assessments. And I'm really keen to share that out, particularly obviously with Victorian venue operators, so that you understand what that means. But what we will do is go into an assessment of your venue, look for the vulnerabilities, and we'll range those between critically down to those that we sometimes have to accept, and those that we can mitigate in other ways. But certainly it's a critical, and it's I guess a risk rating. Those vulnerabilities, and you've heard these terminologies before, they'll be met by what are our mitigating strategies. They'll be mitigating strategies by all stakeholders that have got some sort of involvement in that venue or that event. And then I call them treatments. So what treatments are we then going to put in place to ensure that doesn't take place? Now, again, I know this audience is very learned in this area, but I'll talk to you about our position, if you like, around that. So we look at, and I will refer to my notes, we look at some of the areas that are of the highest risk, and of course, armed offender, active armed offender is something that we're looking to do, mitigate all the time. And I'll talk through some of the mitigations in a second. The other part, of course, is a hostile vehicle. What does that mean? So White Night was an event that I managed from a VicPol perspective, if anyone's in here from that event. That was probably one of the most highest risks that I've ever had to deal with in terms of bringing hundreds of thousands of people into the city. Activations right across Melbourne CBD. How do we prevent hostile vehicle? What was the traffic management plans from our perspective and from all the event organisers? Enormous piece of logistics, enormous. And it went off well, but sometimes you look back on it, the learnings and what we could do better. So when they cancelled White Night, I was fairly relieved. So the next part would be just around this some stuff is that vulnerabilities, mitigation treatments. It's the stakeholder engagement piece. So VicPol have only got X amount, and we've certainly got some great skills around our service and security service divisions. So for those of you in the room, again, I'm going to continue to apologise. So our public order response team have other skills as well. Clearly, our special operations group, bomb response unit, sniffer dogs, will apply things like search and rescue. What does that mean to your venue? Well, if you've got a risk, we're prepared to put obviously a white level search through, put the dogs through, put a BRU through pre-event to make sure that we can keep the place safe, and there's a whole range of things that go with that. We can put people on site, and we certainly do for events, which I'll talk through in a minute, is like the AFL Grand Final. On site, I will have, as the police commander, bomb response unit, special operations group, search and rescue, critical incident response team, which are there for active armed offender as well. I now have the access and we really built our capability around drone, which is called our remote pilot assessment systems. We have anti-drone, counter-drone, and we tried out something recently at the Spring Carnival around Air Enforcer, which if those in the room know what that is. But essentially, I'm probably drifting off a bit here, but essentially, because I'm pretty excited by this stuff, is that, because I do think that drones are going to be a significant risk, if they're not already, to events. They are already. So Air Enforcer gives us the ability to be able to do some things with the drone that we haven't been able to do before if there's one in the air. So just something to keep in mind. It's online. You can have a look at it. So I'll go back to some of those vulnerabilities and mitigation options, contingencies, some of the things that we've got. I forget things sometimes that I always use, like mounted, bike patrol, obviously GDs. If I put it in perspective around the MCG, Michael, and you might be able to pick me up where I fall over here, but just some of the work we do around the MCG and particularly grand final, but leading up to the grand final, quite often we'll find ourselves with 80 or 90,000 at the G, maybe over 3 weeks, potentially over 4. We'll also throw into that in a normal pre-COVID and obviously post-COVID, hopefully, is the, the grand final parade. Grand final parade is a higher risk to me than the MCG grand final. And I'll let that wash over you and just think about White Night and what the grand final parade means in terms of counter-terrorism and what we would need to do. So sometimes being inside a venue is much easier to police than being outside. So some of the things I'm responsible for as a team, obviously not purely, and obviously we've all got a manager and a boss and report up, but we're leading in, just finished the VRC Carnival, so Melbourne Cup Carnival. Really interesting. We've got an opportunity to test a few things out, as I just said, but also smaller crowds. So we did a couple of other things around CT as well. Coming into, obviously, New Year's Eve, Boxing Day test, and Australian Open are all under my command, if you like, and some of the things that we're working through there. So just to give you a bit of an idea about the size of what we do, and of course all things at Marvel, AAMI, we've got A-League coming up. If there's anyone here from AAMI, we know that A-League's been problematic over time, and we work really closely with, and have done most recently with A-League, about what that's going to be. So just in terms of our command and control, you'll be familiar with how we set up. If you're not, basically there's command structure. We try and take in the key areas of our incident command control system, and that is, we look at the intel, of course. What is the intel telling us? What research have we done? And intel for me is ongoing. It's never stops until the next event, if you like. So it's constantly flowing, always seeking it. And yes, some of the best intel we'll always get is from venue, from stakeholders involved, but also some of the times it's about listening to those other people that might contact police from time to time. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. So we'll do things about, so just if I could bring it back down a little bit, is that we're looking at liquor licensing, public order offending, as well as, what does it mean for terrorism? Because a term I use a lot, and I'm really happy for you to test this, is I think it goes to the presentation from Leighton, is complacency. So I just think that a lot of times we've got really good things in place, and I've just come from 8 months out of quarantine, not me personally, but doing the security on the hotels, the quarantine across Melbourne. The biggest thing, and I kept repeating it at all times, was complacency, is going to be the biggest risk to our organisation. Victoria Police doesn't play in the health space much. If you take out mental health, homelessness, drug and alcohol, we do. But in terms of COVID, we didn't understand. So when we went in with a really blank canvas, the biggest thing I kept saying and repeating ad nauseum was complacency. So I bring it into this conversation. What does it mean for us to be complacent as venue managers, stakeholders? It means everything. Best things in place, someone drops their guard, not looking, going to get a couple of souvlakis, and we've done something horrible, or something horrible has happened as a result of us not being on point. So I'll just bring those things up. We also utilise things like transit police, so that's really big for us at the MCG, so making sure ingress and egress works really well. And something that we use a lot of, and I'm happy to share with this audience, is as defence in depth, depth in defence, grey mile, whatever you want to refer to it as, I call it defence in depth. That is, I strategically put my police officers and assets in places where we know the greatest numbers of people are coming into a venue. Simple, but it works. So we'll even do things like, for example, at the MCG, if I could steal this, Michael, is that we know through the MCG's data that they share with us, the percentages of people that come from the various areas into the MCG. So obviously, Birramar, Richmond, Jolimont, what's that mean? Just coming in generally. So where is my greatest bang for buck, if you like? Where do I put our people? To the point where on some of the night games, when it's late, when people are coming out, I'll actually strategically place police cars, and don't give this away, but place police cars with the lights on through Yarra Park and various areas, because it makes people calm, and it also, believe it or not, but also makes it's less likely for offences, particularly assaults, to be committed when those things are happening. And we've done the data and the research on this, but again, happy to be tested. My predecessor was a great man, Peter O'Neill, those of you know him, Scratcher is referred to. He had a thing called the theatre of policing. It's something I use a lot in my policing, if you like, in terms of how we set up for events. That is, and it all goes to this depth and defence, if you see it, the perception of safety is you are safe. The theatre of policing is putting GDs in places where people are going to see them most. So that's all the theatre of policing is. And again, working with our stakeholders in terms of what does that mean as you come into the venue, when you enter the venue in terms of wanding, searching. I make sure our people are there 100% to support security and staff in doing their job. Just having 2 GDs, I'm not saying that police are any smarter than anyone else in the room, they happen to wear a gun. That gun on their hip provides that extra layer of security. Sometimes I wonder how someone got through, that's one of my jokes, but they do. And they are there to provide a bit of support. That support is gold, and it goes to relationships, which Michael and Darren and I work a lot with. Being able to pick up the phone and having a conversation and saying, Jamie, we don't want your police here, we'd like them there. Happy days, I'll move on. Michael, I think you've got too many security here, I reckon I'd like to see them over there. Happy days, we'll shift them to make it work. Those are super important, particularly when you're in the dynamic of an event with 100,000 people and things are happening. Again, I'm not trying to lecture, I'm just trying to tell you the sort of things that we talk about, because you people could lecture to me about events. And please warm me up, Leighton, if I'm taking too long. We're also trying some other things, and we've got a thing called BOSAR, which is Deployment of Behavioural Awareness Teams. So some of you in the room might know already and may have utilised them. So we're training our police officers to do that, and essentially what it is looking for suspicious behaviour. Our members will be in plain clothes, looking around, walking through, looking for people acting suspiciously that may be a lone wolf and they may be associated in other ways. I often wonder what we do in 30 to 35 weeks of training in police officers if we can't actually come out as a BOSAR. They should already have that training, but it's extra training. And I get it, sometimes we lift the level, those people are interested. I say every police officer should have these skills, but by providing that extra training, hopefully we've got a heightened level of it. That's a really good, something to think about. If you're asking for VicPol to come and support you, ask us about those behavioural awareness people, because they certainly I think will help out in terms of that identification of particularly those that are acting suspiciously. And I want to just jump outside terrorism. Think about sex offenders. Think about other people that are there to cause harm, and not just terrorism. We engage obviously with the event organisers and the people who might be hiring the event, the venue, and we talk about what all their risks are. Of course, that's ongoing. So I'm just going to my notes. Making sure that there are efficient emergency operation centres, venue command centres. Does my head in at every event? Every venue has a different name for what they use as their emergency response area. That's okay. I'm getting used to it. Basically, it's where we all gather and we make the big decisions. Crowd management, I just want to talk to this just quickly. So ongoing, so the really, I guess the heavy lifting that we do leading up to an event and all those great and wonderful toys that I've got at my disposal, if you like, the greatest piece of work we do at a venue in particular, like the MCG, is inside, and it's called engagement. Talk to the crowd, talk to the security, talk to the staff, and understand and get a feel for what it is that's happening in there. That feel and gut feel actually goes towards all the decisions that I will make as a venue police commander about liquor licensing, about where we put our police, where our risks are. And it will matter. It will depend on what the game score is. It will depend on what's happening out, whether there's a concert or not, whether there's a crescendo building. All those things come into play. So they are things that we really try to highlight and make sure that we're talking about all the time. And mixed up with all that is the one thing, although we're the police, we still are there to be firm, friendly, and what I say is probably have an understanding that people have paid money to go to an event. Not probably, they've paid money to go to an event, and they don't need to be over-policed. So the greatest policing I can do is where you can walk away a bit like a football umpire and not see us. Know that we're there, know that we're controlling the game, but we're not actually in your face. That is the best way, that's the best bit of feedback I can get as a police forward commander. So that's pretty much where I'm going to wind up with this presentation, Leighton. But as I said, happy to bring together that protester behaviour environment into what it means as a venue, because probably is one of the first things that's asked of me now if I'm going to a tabletop exercise or just preparing for an event. What is the protester environment? What's the likelihood of protesters turning up to our venue? And that's fine. We can talk through what that means and what that looks like. So, if there's any questions now, or you're going to run it from here?
We can run it from here.
Beautiful. Thanks, mate.
Take a load off. Good on you, James. I might say, just take the opportunity.
Thank you.
I have talked to many of my colleagues over the years interstate about policing and how the venues interact with the local police force, and we've clearly got the best relationship with our police force, and there's some horror stories from interstate, and we're not one of them, so well done, you guys. I want to go on to the next stage now. I want to pick the brains of the two guys in the middle and make them sing for their supper. They were deliberately chosen here because Darren has, while certainly extremism is a risk, it always will be, but Darren has dealt with a lot of protest activity over the years, and I wanted you to talk about that if you can, Darren, and the prevalence of that. And Michael obviously is one of the great targets in the world probably for extremist attack. But probably more increasingly being exposed to the protests of people. So Darren, I guess what I want to ask you is, what do you take out of the case study? You're very much across what Jamie does already. Where do we sit as an industry in your mind, and what's the to-do list look like?
Oh, look, you know, the case study is pretty sombering for security and safety managers and venue managers as a whole, really. We've been sort of, you know, dormant for 20 months, so I really think it's time for us to snap back into a bit of action and, you know, blow the dust off the emergency management plans, off the, you know, your incident action plans. There was something that came out of that inquiry, and there was an expert that said, you know, the terrorists haven't been, you know, baking sourdough for the last 20 months, you know, so, you know, we all have at home. So it's really important that we get back into action, and you said it yourself during the inquiry that there was, you know, an average time 4 minutes spent on, you know, online learning. So there's nothing better than getting back into your venues and practicing your emergency management procedures and your incident management procedures, and testing your bag checking and warning stations again, and really going through all that sort of stuff again. So I think that's really important. You know, first thing you should do when you get back in is really get stuck into some of that stuff again. You know, in terms of protest action and activism, you know, we've worked with Jamie really closely before on some of the large events that we've had here. You know, really planning everything right back, you know, 3-6 months prior to the event is, you know, planning and getting your processes and your contingency plans in place is just so vitally important. Bringing your stakeholders along for the ride as well, whether it's VicPol or Ambulance Victoria, your precinct stakeholders as well. It's just so important to have everyone on the same page and reading from the same, you know, hymn book. So I think that's really important. You know, identifying global trends as well is important. Doing a bit of scraping in relation to intel. There's lots of sort of packages that you can use these days to sort of check social media, because, you know, a lot of these organisations are active on social media. Extinction Rebellion are very present on social media, you know, so you can type in your keywords and really sort of extract as much information as you can to assist you to help prepare for some of those events. And on that, you know, you can have a 20 packs AGM or a board meeting or something like that, and it can present more risks sometimes than a, you know, 5,000 packs expo. So depending on the company or, you know, whoever is in your building, sometimes these activists don't need much of a, you know, bit of a dotted line between that and, you know, Adani or whoever it may be. And they'll target it. So it's pretty important to sort of be across almost every event. You know, we have, when we're at full steam, have about 1,500 a year here. So it's really important to be across sort of almost every event, identify the risks that are involved with each and every event.
If anyone hasn't watched Social Dilemma on Netflix, they should do so. And it talks about the increasing polarisation of society being fuelled by social media. So extreme views getting supported by information that gets fed to them by an algorithm that makes them click on the story more and more often because they like the story because it's reinforcing what they believe. And so people are getting more and more polarised in society. Have you seen an increase in protest activity at this venue over recent years?
Yeah, I'd definitely say that. I mean, you know, we had a mining conference which in 2018 wasn't too bad. We had, 50 pretty hardcore extremists turn up for that one. And then the following year in 2019, it really blew up. So from one year to the next, and I know we've got a talk on sustainability and the environment and all that sort of stuff later. That's really present in the activism space at the moment. So anything to do with the environment, it's a real watch point.
Yep, great. Michael, you're a learned man. You've been around a little while. Did you learn anything out of that case study?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll stay right off the top. It's really nice to be here talking about security with the safety and responsibility as well. It feels like for the last 20 months it has been all about COVID, and I've been incredibly well supported over this period by our security team. We've got our Security Services Manager, Hannah Boyle, here today, and our other colleague, Mark Oxton, who've really been doing an incredible job, and I'll talk about some of the things that they've implemented over this last period, which picks up on some of the themes from the case study. So I think the first one being leadership, and I think it's really, really crucial to get that buy-in from the highest levels right up to your board committee level. We're very fortunate at the Melbourne Cricket Club to have that. So we actually just about when the pandemic hit, we'd released our new strategic plan, and one of the key lenses through which we do everything at the Melbourne Cricket Club is safety and security. So it covers every aspect. Everything that we're trying to achieve has to be seen through the lens of delivering safe and secure experiences for everyone who we work with and who works with us. So that's really, really crucial, and that goes to that leadership point in the case study. The risk-based approach is crucial as well, and the point about having the right risk assessment for the right thing really rang true to me. So for us, a lot of the initiatives that are talked about in terms of that case study, longer term things, they're CapEx improvements in your video surveillance system or your analytical software or whatever it might mean. That can't be done overnight. You can't click your fingers and do those sorts of things. So you need to have a strategic approach at a higher level to your risk assessment. That's the way we do it at the MCC as well. So that's looking at some of those points that Jane was talking around, your critical assets, understanding your business impact assessment, how vulnerable those assets are, understanding the threat to you as a business or an organisation. So what are those intent and capabilities that you could be faced with, not just terrorism, but other threat sources that you might face, and then feeding that into that strategic risk assessment. We approach that from a resilience approach, so understand things that we can prevent and mitigate, how we can prepare ourselves to respond and deal with threats, how do we respond, and how do we recover effectively, and that's how we frame that. And that then drives our strategic security, safety and precinct operations master plan, and that gets signed off at a high level. Then for particular events, we have an event-specific security risk assessment, and that, we're working on one at the moment for Boxing Day test, for example, and that looks at those particular aspects and elements of that event, which will drive our more operational decision-making in terms of the measures and arrangements we put in place. The technology and human factors side of things, so the report talks about blind spots in the video surveillance system. It doesn't talk about things like analytics, but being ahead of the curve in terms of technology available to support your security operations is really important as well. So something like, in this example, analytics software overlaid on a video surveillance system that could actually pick up that person shouldn't have been there, and there is technology out there that purports to do those sorts of things, could have been a huge benefit potentially in this situation as well. Blind spot rectification is something that we've done for a number of years. So we have a standing budget, CapEx budget each year to review our video surveillance system. And again, Hannah's been doing a lot of work on this for us over recent months to identify those blind spots in the system, the critical areas that we want to protect better, and actually putting in cameras to support our security arrangements around those areas. Training, Jamie mentioned behavioural observation and suspicious activity recognition, so that's something that we've invested in for our core security team. So that's our MCC security team, and something we're increasingly thinking about for our security contractors. Really important as well to have those refresher training courses. That's pricked something in my mind that we probably need to focus on that going forward in terms of refreshers around BOSAR. But again, Hannah and the team have instituted a counter-terrorism month, for example, which is coming up for us, actually focusing on the Manchester bombing incident, lessons we can learn from that, case studies from experts in the UK and things like that, which is really, really good and will provide some refresher for our team around behavioural observations, suspicious activity recognition work. Obviously we've had challenges with COVID, and the report highlights the importance of the face-to-face training and practical training and experience as well. So that's something for us to focus on, I think, over this next period. Continuous improvement is a highlight of the report also, so learning from events like this, using resources that are out there and available to VMA members. So the International Association of Venue Managers has a whole bunch of useful resources which we can tap into. I'm representing on the International Safety and Security Committee, so if anyone has any questions about what's out there, what training courses, what other resources are available, please reach out to me and I can plug you into that. There's other forums locally, the Crowded Places Forum run by VicPol, it's really useful information in there as well. So use those resources. At the national level, audits and checklists related to protecting crowded places from terrorism are available, and they're useful just as a sense check and a check-in for yourself to understand how you're actually achieving those objectives on those strategies and plans. Coordination, going to Jamie's points as well, and yours as well, leading around coordination and consultation. In my experience, not only nationally but internationally, we're very fortunate here in Victoria. The relationship with VicPol is really incredible. Sharing of information, understanding each other's capabilities, roles and responsibilities is really crucial. So engaging with Jamie and his colleagues in a positive way is really good. Shield also, there's CT Shield, which has recently been released by Victoria Police. So that's an online system that venue operators can plug into for current information in relation to counter-terrorism, other security threats. So I encourage people to reach out to the VicPol contact to get in touch with that system as well and get plugged in. And the last one I mentioned that's been touched on a few times is those protest threats that we're concerned about leading up to the summer, particularly around the test, mass violent protests, and we've also experienced environmental protests in the past. Given the global exposure an event like the Boxing Day test presents, that could be a focus for us as well as we lead into the summer of cricket.
Great.
Thanks, Lee.
The point you make about the resources I think is really important. One of the surprised look on the face of the head of the inquiry came when he learned that the industry in the UK didn't have a best practice code of practice to follow. And there has been attempts at this in the past. They haven't been maintained, but he was quite shocked to think that a profession such as venue management didn't have in place a best practice code. And I think that's a real sweet spot for the association. If Michael's watching this in Brisbane, he'll roll his eyes and think, I haven't got enough to do, that's good, I'm really pleased you brought that up. But I think it's a real responsibility of this association to work in that space. We have plans for security management school going forward. And I think the basis of that school would be that type of a code. Because I don't think we're doing our job as an association if we don't involve ourselves in that area. Jamie, you can jump in on this question, but I'm going to ask it to Darren, but I'm going to ask you to think about it because you deal with a lot of security contractors. And I'm just wondering, Darren, from your perspective, do you see in your time here, do you see a leaning towards appointing security contractors on capability and not just on price? Because I know that security contractors haven't had a proud history of paying their staff appropriately, and venues haven't had a proud history of paying appropriately for security services. And you get what you pay for, as exhibited in that case study. Do you think venues are ready to pay the right price for those sort of services?
Oh, I hope so. it should all be capability and not price, because at the end of the day, like Manchester, we're talking about people's lives that are potentially at risk with, you know, poor practices and poor standards. You know, there are lots of problems with the security industry. We won't kick them while they're down, but you know, it's all about, we've spoken about it a lot up here today, leadership and the briefings as well. So transfer of information and really imparting the information, the risks around an event to security supervisors who can pass it on to the people on the floor that are, you know, providing that service. Because quite often these people that are, you know, providing security at large venues with critical risk, it's their second or it's their third or their fourth job. So, you know, that's why that leadership and the briefings just need to be so spot on. But capability over price every time, and yeah, it'd really be nice to see a shift in that space going forward.
Jamie, without offending anyone, have you seen that improve over time, or well, we've got a dearth of labour right now, so maybe it's going to go backwards for 12 months?
Yeah, interesting. I was listening intently there, Darren. I agree just about everything you said, and I don't disagree with anything you said. Yes, different venues, different security companies, different leadership, different briefings certainly impacts the results, there's no doubt. We've tried to implement ourselves, insert ourselves into some of the briefings with security. We do it really well, I think, Michael, at the MCC, in terms of we come along, but we don't take the briefing, but we're there to take questions and reinforce or set the tone, whatever it is it might be. The other thing we do is, you know, in the RSA place as well, we sort of will talk to what does responsible service of alcohol mean to those people doing that role. But unfortunately, and I'll stop on this point, I was involved in the quarantine way back. I was involved with a number of different contractors that were there, and you know, that highlighted probably to me mostly about the differences between some of the companies. So that's a matter for the industry to work out, and for Victoria Police's regulation, of course. But I do see, and I want to reiterate, the leadership and the briefing and the way that they set the tone to their team at the start of an event really does make a difference.
Yeah, I think you're right. It is for the industry to work out. We've only got a few minutes left, and we've worked these people pretty hard. But are there any other questions from the audience where you've got this group?
Paul, do you want to shout it to me and I'll shout it out on behalf of everyone else? Sure.
Hi, Paul McCarthy, PBM Safety. Just a couple of observations from my point over the last 20 months. There's been quite a strong, obviously, focus on COVID protocols for our events, etc. Now that we're in that situation where that is less of a focus, that there's still an element of people from an event background that are still not remembering the other 400 things that you need to think about in terms of risk profiling. The other thing I wanted to observe too was that, Darren, how many people do you have in your department?
4.
Yeah, and Michael, how many in yours?
Security only.
Well, both of you got security and safety in your mandate.
1, 2, 3, 4.
I guess
5.
the point that I'm driving at is that there are a lot of smaller venues. I mean, from a targeting point of view, the upper echelon venues, like your venues, are pretty well prepared, yes, and there's always improvement in there. The fact now is that it's probably going to be the second and third tier venues that are going to become more of a popular target for some of these groups, and looking at how some of these people can resource up with the skill sets that you guys have at your beck and call to do what you need to do. This is probably, it's a major thing that I'm seeing, particularly in your smaller venues, is how do you know, I mean, I get contracted to come in to help with some risk and safety profiling, and I'm probably working with a contractor rather than an in-house security team. What's your thoughts on that, guys?
Well, I think that's an opportunity for the association is my view, to be able to upskill people at all levels of venues, whether they're at a town hall at Wangaratta, you know. That's what the association's here for, and I think it's got a responsibility to work and be active in that space.
Yeah, that idea, as you mentioned, a safety and security school or whatever it is, I think it's fantastic. It's making those members who don't have the same sort of resources as an MCC or an MSEC aware of the other opportunities that are out there to build their capabilities, but also to plug into the networking opportunities, and it can almost become a mentoring type of relationship with some of the bigger venues. And I know we're happy to help out in that area. We do a lot of work collaborating, as you'd expect, with the big venues around the country, but some of those are nowhere near as big as the MCG, and we're happy to help. So, and you know, likewise for some of the smaller venues, we'd be happy to do that too. So, absolutely, that is a leadership role for VMA in identifying opportunities to be able to plug those smaller venues into the bigger venues. I think would be really valuable.
And I think how we've seen the venue management school work so well has been that passing on of information, experience and knowledge, Paul. So I think a replica of that model in the security and safety space would add enormous value. Thank you. Any other questions before we wrap up?
G'day, Sarge.
Paul Sarge at ASF, just a question really for all three of the panellists. We've focused a lot on front of house, so I just want to talk a bit about back of house. From you, Jamie, what's your view about the vulnerability of any insider threats, given we're all so massively reliant on contractors, catering, cleaning, security, a whole bunch of people we don't know. And then for both Darren and Michael, what do you do at the moment to combat?
Sarge, would you mind repeating all of that again for the benefit of the recording?
Okay, right. Look, based on looking at, we've covered a lot of front of house, so I just want to look at back of house, and 2 points really. One for Jamie, what's your assessment, I suppose, of an insider threat? What's the vulnerability? What do you see in terms of an insider threat as we all deal with contractors and our own staff, stewards, ushers, catering staff, cleaners, security staff? And then likewise for Darren and Michael, what are you doing internally to vet, to check anything, nothing, it's in the pipeline? Just interesting to see where we're at with that particular threat.
Well, I'll start because I'm glad you asked that question because I wrote some notes, but I didn't get to it. But essentially, it is a significant threat, and it's one that we need to ensure that we continually focus on. It becomes part of our vulnerability assessment. We certainly have the conversations. I think anything to do with technology in particular, when we look at accreditations, insider knowledge, what that might be, is something that we're turning our mind to and our focus on more and more, and we're becoming better equipped, I think. Victoria Police has traditionally been a little bit, or law enforcement agencies, a little bit slow to catch up to some of the technology, and I think that goes without saying. But in the last bit of time, probably through COVID, we've had the opportunity to do some further learnings and some understanding. So it is certainly a threat. Some of my notes I had here was that what we would look for in conversation and consultation is that the unauthorised access, use or disclosure of privileged information. So that's what we touched on. Those techniques, technology and the assets within the premises, so availability to them and who has them, legitimate or indirect access. What does that mean? And then the other part was that trusted insiders piece around former employees as well as current. So it's something that we ask people to turn their minds to, and just their legitimacy to access and how that plays out. So I would say it's certainly something that's one of our focus, but we rely on the consultation and the stakeholder engagement, if you like, to work through that.
Yeah, look, for us, it's pretty much some of the standard things that you do, like police checks for employees before they start. We've got swipe access into the building so that can be deactivated for employees that have been terminated or disgruntled. So there's basic things like that. Identifying high risk roles that require police checks every 3 years or whatever that may be. So having a look at the frequency of the police checking. But the reality is, with the flow or the flux, I guess, of when you've got a lot of events on is that you've got to rely on agency staff and casuals. So it does become really difficult, and it's something that we constantly sort of keeping our eye on dealing with.
Similar to Darren in terms of that background checking, police checking, those sorts of things. Something we've done recently is an audit of access into spaces, particularly critical spaces, to see if anyone's trying to get access to areas where they shouldn't be on the access control system. For our big events, where we call them our marquee games, we'll establish a clean venue essentially, so empty the venue a period of time prior to the event, conduct a search and sweep of the venue, including with detector dog units, and therefore give us some confidence in terms of the cleanliness of the venue, for want of a better term, and then everyone coming into the venue post that is screened and checked and access controlled. So that's for some of our bigger events, and then for things like World Cups and things like that, the organisers of those events will generally, at least for critical spaces, arrange accreditation, background checking, including ASIO national security checks for some critical roles and spaces, access to certain spaces as well. So that's another element for us in terms of those big tournaments.
I know we have to go, Catherine. If anybody wants a copy of the overhead to take back to their venue, you're very welcome. Just talk to our Director of Information Technology over the corner here, Matthew Howe, or myself, and we'll make sure you get a copy.
Great.
Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you so much, everyone, and I'd really like to thank our panel. I think it's a really timely reminder of as we're getting gig fit, all of the things that we actually need to be thinking about. A couple of things I'm just going to touch on very quickly before we go into tea was that the terrorism hasn't gone away, and a whole raft of threats that we need to address. One quote that I actually really liked from one of the videos is that we are entrusted with people's loved ones. That is something that we as venue managers obviously do every day, and it's a really nice reminder of that key role that we play. A couple other themes that were really important to me were leadership, communication, building and improving culture and attitude, and as well as the relationship. I really liked the comments, especially from Jamie, about talking to people, breaking down those sort of social stigmas, as it were, and actually just really talking with people and having a great relationship with all of your venues.